Okay, good morning, everyone, or good day, wherever you may be. Welcome to the Ateneo de Manila University, Department of Economics, and Ateneo Center for Economic Research and Development Seminar Series. For those of you who are joining us for the first time and who have not been inside Ateneo, we hope that you enjoyed our short virtual tour. My name is Mahalea Ravago, and I will be your moderator for this morning. Before we start, let me just remind you of the house rules that we have. We will let our speaker finish his presentation first before we entertain questions. Zoom participants, kindly stay muted and stop sharing your video during the duration of the presentation. During Q&A, please virtually raise your hand and wait to be acknowledged. You may unmute and show yourself when asking your questions. For our participants on Facebook, please post your questions in the comment sections. For those asking questions both on Facebook and Zoom, kindly acknowledge your institutional affiliation before asking your questions. Slide videos and other materials from the seminar are posted on our website only when the speaker gives his consent for sharing them. And this morning, our speaker gave his consent for sharing the video, okay? We are very fortunate to have this morning our speaker, Professor Dean Yang. He is a professor in the Department of Economics and the Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. His research agenda spans a range of applied microeconomic topics, including international migration, finance, health, disasters, trade, religion, and political economy. Methodologically, much of his work involves randomized controlled trials in the field settings, while other work involves unearthing and analyzing novel data sources. He is currently running randomized controlled trials on remittances among migrant workers in the UAE and on HIV/AIDS interventions in Mozambique. His past and current field research locations include El Salvador, Guatemala, Indonesia, Malawi, Mozambique, and the Philippines, as well as migrant populations of Filipinos in Italy, Indians in Qatar, and Salvadorans and Kenyans in the US. He teaches courses in development economics at the PhD, master, and undergraduate levels. A native of the Philippines, he received his undergraduate and PhD degrees in economics from Harvard University. This morning, he is here with us to share their ongoing research titled Abundance from Abroad, Migrant Income and Economic Development in the Philippines. Without further ado, please help me welcome in the virtual floor, Professor Dean Yang.
Magandang umaga sa inyong lahat. It is evening here, but I'll say that anyway. Thank you very much for hosting me. I'm very honored to be joining you all today. Let me share my screen. Okay, let me just make sure this is visible to everyone.
Yes.
Does that work? Okay. So, again, very happy to be here. This is joint work with Gaurav Khanna, who happens to be here, also on video, joining us from UC San Diego. Emir Murathanoglu, one of our PhD students here at Michigan, and Caroline Theoharides, PhD alumnus of ours now at Amherst College in Massachusetts. I'd like to put this work in broader context, even though it's clearly about the Philippines. We know broadly from economics research worldwide that when people move from developing countries to developed countries for work, they enjoy huge income gains. So here's just some data from work done by Gibson, McKenzie, and Stillman from their South Pacific research on migration to New Zealand, showing that prior to migration, migrants and non-migrants have very similar wages. But when migrants get the opportunity to migrate because of getting visa access via a lottery to New Zealand, their income goes up 4 times. And those gains persist and even magnify up to 5 times if you look forward a decade later. You can look at this beyond just individual experiments, and you can tabulate these data more broadly, as Clemens, Montenegro, and Pritchett have done in some very nice work documenting that when you look at individuals who show up in US Census data or US Labor Force Survey data and compare their wages with observationally similar people from labor force surveys back home, people with similar wages who got their education in the home country before emigrating, you see similar huge increases in wages when people move from developing to developed countries. And so I think it's well established. Maybe I don't need to emphasize this further, that when people move to the developed world from developing countries, their income gains are huge. Hundreds of millions of people do make such moves in order to enjoy these income gains. And the remittances they send home are today the largest type of international financial flow going to developing countries. This is data from 1990 to just about the present. Vertical axis is billions of US dollars. And for a long time, migrant remittances, the red-orange line, have been the #2 type of international financial flow going to developing countries, second to foreign direct investment. But with the pandemic, FDI flows have fallen quite dramatically, and remittances for the first time in history have overtaken foreign direct investment as and remittances are now the #1 type of international financial flow flowing to developing countries. Remittances are also about 3 times larger than ODA, official development assistance, or foreign aid, which is also a widely studied type of international financial flow. So just to underline that remittances are a very important phenomenon, for developing countries, and it'd be very important to try to understand their economic impacts. Motivated by these gains, by these economic gains from international migration and the remittances that follow, most developing country governments are incorporating international migration into their development policy making in some way. I think that's probably, this is an audience of folks mostly in the Philippines. So I think that's, certainly not surprising to anyone observing Philippine development policy making. But one thing that I was surprised, frankly, when these data came out. This is from a survey done by the UN in 2019 called the UN Survey of Governments. It's quite striking how, when you look at various dimensions, various ways in which development policy making can incorporate international migration, the vast majority of countries are doing at least something. 94.3% of governments have a national migration policy agency. 88% have a government unit dedicated to overseas citizens and overseas employment. A bit more than 80% have a national labor migration strategy. About, roughly 3/4 promote fair and ethical treatment of migrant workers and promote the flow of remittances. Now, one thing that's a little bit misleading about these tabulations is that these data don't say anything about the intensity or the scale with which governments are undertaking these activities. Like, some of these government agencies may be very small and not very important in the broad scheme of things in a particular country. But I think it does indicate that for the vast majority of countries, international migration is on the radar screen as a policy tool to promote development of the home country. Therefore, it's really important to try to understand what the development impacts might be of promoting international labor migration. So that brings us to our question for today. Really, it's quite surprising that there's actually quite scarce evidence, very little evidence on the impact of international migrant income on the development of migrants' origin areas, their home areas. And so that's the question that we are focused on in this work. When migrant income opportunities arise, what are the long-run impacts for migrant home areas? And there are a couple of different dimensions to this question that we'll be focusing on. The first is, are the gains mostly concentrated in the international labor market, or do the gains also extend to the domestic economy of migrants' origin areas? So when we say gains concentrated in the international labor market, you might imagine, all we mean is very simply that when you open up opportunities for international labor migration, well, maybe all of the benefits really just show up in the form of higher migrant income, which is a benefit, of course. The migrants themselves and their families benefit from the higher income and higher consumption that results. But maybe there are no gains that accrue to the domestic economy from which the migrants came. So that's why it's important. We think it's very important to think about these two dimensions, and we'll be able to actually look at impacts on both migrant income and migrants' participation in and performance in the international labor market, and also at impacts on the domestic economy. And clearly, these answers to these questions are of interest to policymakers who seek to understand the long-run impacts of facilitating international migrant work. This really helps, policymakers, in other countries, not just the Philippines, decide how much they want to emphasize or scale up their emphasis on international migrant work as part of their development policymaking. Okay, so that's where we're coming from here. So what do we do in this paper? This is one slide, basically giving you a capsule summary of what we're doing. So we're asking, how does international migrant income affect long-run economic development in migrant origin areas in the Philippines? And we'll be looking across all Philippine provinces using a shift share identification strategy. So in order to determine the causal impact of international migrant income on migrant origin areas in the Philippines, we're not able to carry out a randomized control trial where we can randomly assign some provinces or some areas to having higher migrant income than others. Instead, we take advantage of a natural experiment. The natural experiment, technically involves, the technical term for what we're doing is a shift share identification strategy, or a shift share approach. But the intuition behind it, if you don't recall your econometrics, is fairly straightforward. First of all, we're taking advantage of exchange rate shocks that occurred in migrant destinations due to the 1997 Asian financial crisis. So in the shift share terminology, these are the shifts. Many of you on this call will remember the Asian financial crisis of 1997, when the Philippine peso depreciated substantially from about 25 pesos to the dollar to about 50 pesos to the dollar over a very short period. And since then, the exchange rate hasn't, vis-a-vis the US dollar, has of course changed somewhat, but it has never shifted back anywhere near its original level of 20 or 25 pesos per dollar prior to the Asian financial crisis. Now, that clearly was a huge shock to the Philippine economy, but it ended up actually having quite, the Asian financial crisis had very different effects on migrants who are located in different countries overseas, depending on whether those countries also experience a depreciation of the exchange rate or a devaluation of the exchange rate during the Asian crisis as well. So migrants overseas who are earning in US dollars, in the US or other countries whose currencies were linked to the US dollar, experienced a huge positive shock. All of a sudden, their earnings overseas were convertible to many more Philippine pesos than they were otherwise. But then there are other migrants in places like Korea or Malaysia, Indonesia as well, but there are not many Filipino migrants in Indonesia, whose currency is also depreciated by about as much as the Philippine peso. And so they didn't experience a negative shock to the value of their earnings in Philippine pesos, because their currencies moved by about as much as the Philippine peso. So their earnings it was basically a wash for them. It was basically stable. So that's the type of variation we're taking advantage of. Currencies in European countries were, somewhat in the middle. They depreciated somewhat, but not by as much as the Malaysian or Korean currencies. So those are the shocks. We're taking advantage of those shocks. And we're taking advantage of the fact that those shocks actually affected different provinces in the Philippines differently, depending on how many migrants those provinces had overseas in different destination countries and how much they were earning overseas. So basically, we take the measure of how much migrants from different provinces were earning in different currencies overseas in different locations as a measure of exposure of the different provinces to this shock. So these are in technical terms, these are the shares and the shift share identification strategy. So I don't want to, I want to try to have this talk be accessible to folks who have the econometric background as well as those who don't. So I just want to emphasize again the intuition behind this. We are, this map here shows different provinces of the Philippines in different colors depending on the size of the shock. We're looking, all of these shocks that Philippine provinces experienced in the wake of the Asian financial crisis were positive shocks to migrant income, because migrant incomes almost always increased in value in Philippine peso terms because of these exchange rate movements. But the provinces differed in the size of the positive shock, how positive the shock was. Some provinces had a lot of migrants sending money home from overseas, earning money overseas in currencies that had a very positive movement vis-a-vis the Philippine peso. And other provinces either didn't have a lot of migrant earnings to begin with, or had migrants in places that experienced relatively poor movements of exchange rates compared to the Philippine peso. So that's driving differences across provinces in migrant income going forward. So basically, we're going to be using this shift share variable as a measure of an exogenous or natural experimental change in migrant income. And then we're going to look at how outcomes in 74 different provinces change over 3 decades, from 1985 through 2018. So we have about 12 years of data before the Asian financial crisis, and then about 2 decades worth of data afterwards. I mentioned, those of you who know your Philippine geography know that today the Philippines has more than 74 provinces. We didn't make an error here. What we're using is the definition of 74 provinces that existed in 1990, used in the 1990 Philippine census. And we've combined geographic areas that may have split later into their original definitions of provinces as the 74 provinces that existed in 1990. At the end, we also introduce a simple structural model that allows us to quantify some of the mechanisms, in particular educational investments that may be mechanisms through which the long run effects are happening. Okay, so this is broadly what we're doing in this paper. Let me just pause for a second and ask Maha, are we going until 9:40 before we open up for questions, or 9:45?
Yes.
Tell me.
9:45.
9:45. Okay, great. I'll make sure that we get there. Okay, so what do we find overall? So these exogenous positive shocks to migrant income lead to substantial increases in household domestic Philippine income per capita at the province level. So it's not only this shock which leads to increases in migrant income into the peso converted value of migrant income, because of these exchange rate shocks, actually have a big impact over 2 decades later, over the course of 2 decades afterwards, on domestic earning capacity in the Philippines as well. So we see so the gains are not just in higher migrant income, but actually in higher domestic income in home areas as well. This occurs alongside further increases in migrant income. So we actually see gains in migrant income that magnify over time. It looks like migrants are, well, let me come to why that's happening shortly, but basically the migrant income goes up as well. It's not limited to just the increases implied by the exchange rate movement, but actually we see further increases over time. About 80, we define the concept of global income, which is Philippine domestic income plus migrant income. This is a concept actually that isn't, or this is a concept of income that hasn't actually often been calculated, and we provide what we view as a plausible estimate of Philippine global income, adding up domestic income as well as the income, overseas income of migrant workers, to come up with a concept of global income. And about 80% of the increase in global income actually comes from domestic income. So the vast majority of the gains from this shock to migrant, this initial shock to migrant income, actually come in the form of increases in income in the provinces back home from which the migrants originate. Alongside this broad increase in global income, we also see increases in consumption per capita. So if you view consumption, as most economists do, as a valid measure of people's economic well-being, and some people think consumption is a better measure of well-being than income, then we document that consumption goes up as well. So this is not just an income increase, but people's consumption, living standards are going up as well. These gains remain roughly stable for over 2 decades after the shock. And the gains are fairly sizable in magnitude. Every 0.1 unit of the shock leads to about 3.4% higher consumption or income per capita. What is a 0.1 unit of the shock? Let me just sort of go back to the map here. If you can see the legend over here, these different shadings move in 0.1 units. So every every slightly darker shade is a 0.1 higher, 0.1 more positive shock. Like for example, the difference between Bulacan here and Pampanga. Those two differ by 1 shading, and the difference in the shock for those two, across those 2 provinces is about 0.1, and that's associated with about 3.4% higher consumption and income. So that's just to give you a sense of the magnitude. So if we're talking about differences of 0.2 or 0.3, like between the difference between this shade and this shade, or this shade and this shade, then that would be, a 0.3 difference would be close to around a 10% difference in income and consumption. So not crazily large, but but measurable and meaningful differences in income and consumption are being driven by this shock. Okay, what are the mechanisms leading to these increases in domestic income? So just again to reiterate, these exchange rate shocks lead to big increases in migrant income converted into Philippine pesos. That clearly benefits households back home, but from which these migrants originated. But this shock clearly has positive impacts on the broader Philippine economy in home areas by raising people's wages in the domestic economy and their earnings from household enterprises. And that's really what we show in terms of trying to sort out the mechanisms. First of all, it looks like the shock leads to increases in education. People in particular are more able to invest in tertiary college education. So we see at the province level back in the Philippines, tertiary education levels are going up. The shock also seems to be leading people to make more investments in their domestic household enterprises, small enterprises. Their incomes from domestic enterprises are going up as well. And on the international migrant front, we also see a shift towards higher skilled, higher wage international migrant work. That's quite striking as well, and quite visible in the data. So those are the mechanisms through which the increase in domestic income is happening. Households are investing in education, they're investing in their small enterprises, and both of those are raising their ability to earn income in the domestic economy. We view these as fairly important. This is a fairly important high-level result that gains in international migrant income actually extend to clear benefits in the domestic economy back home in terms of higher incomes. We go through the structural model. We introduce a structural model to try to sort of organize and quantify these results in terms of mechanisms, and we can rationalize the overall magnitudes and show that at about 1/5 of the long-run gains in income are due to the educational investments that people are able to make because of the positive migrant income shock. Okay, so those of you who are know your econometrics and have run diff and diff analyses or shift share analyses over over time periods, in using panel data, are used to looking at event studies where you want to see whether there is a pre-trend in the treatment effect. So basically, we're showing here coefficients on our main shift share variable in our regression. I'll go back. I'm just showing this at the outset, and I'll come back to the regression specification later if I have time. But basically, there's really no effect of the treatment in the pre 1997 period before the shock from 85 to 97. But then afterwards, there's a clear positive movement in consumption per capita, which is the blue dots, and total income per capita, which is the red diamonds. So about the increase in consumption per capita is a little bit lower than the increase in income, reflecting a fairly high but not 100% marginal propensity to consume out of income. So this is the event study that sort of summarizes the effects all the way from the start of the shock in 1997 all the way through 2018, more than 2 decades later. Okay, so that's the sort of high level overview of what we've done and what we found. Some brief words about international migration from the Philippines. I know a lot of people on this call are familiar with this context, but others might not be. Even though I think even though most people on the call are from the Philippines, I don't want to assume that everyone is fully versed in the context. So clearly, international migration affects a substantial share of the Philippine population. First of all, we calculate that migrant income is about 12% of global income in the Philippines. If you recall, we defined global income as domestic Philippine income plus the income of migrant workers. If you add those together, you get global income, and migrant income is about 12% of global income in the Philippines during our time period. That's a new number. You can quote us. I'm not sure if many people have calculated that figure before, but we put that out there. Just sharing some data from the Philippine census, as well as the FIS, the Family Income and Expenditure Survey, showing how pervasive international migration and remittances are in the Philippine economy. So migrants, as a share of the Philippine population, rose from about 0.7% to 2.2% of the Philippine population over this time period, from 1990 to 2015. The share of households with a migrant member rose from 3.2% to 7.5% of households, reflecting the fact that sort of migrants tend to be fairly, this is a higher share than the share of migrants in the population, because migrants tend to be relatively well distributed, across households. Not all the migrants are coming from a small number of households. But the share of households receiving remittances is substantially higher than those figures. These data are from the FIS. From 1991 to 2018, we see the share of households receiving remittances rise from about 17% to close to 30%. So, the incomes earned by migrants are extending to a much broader swath of households in the population than just those that from which the migrant originated. So I think many folks in the Philippines are familiar with this, that the international migration is largely temporary and legal labor migration through licensed recruitment agencies. People are going away on relatively short, about 2-year contracts, but often going for multiple contractual periods, renewing contracts over time. Filipinos go to a very diverse set of country destinations compared to most other countries that send out international labor migrants, and that's because the Philippines for a long time has had very well developed institutions for international labor migration. In the mid 1990s, right before the shock, overseas Filipino workers, OFWs, were already located in 171 different countries, and there are 104 different countries in our data. We can see that many in our data. One thing that we're doing that's unusual and new in this work is we are working with a data set that we obtained from the POEA, which we're showing here. Many of you probably are familiar with that building, and OWA, the Overseas Workers Welfare Administration. We got data from POEA and OWA that arise from migrants filling out these so-called OFW information sheets, which then lead to migrants getting their overseas employment certificates that allow them to leave the country, that serves as their travel clearance when they leave the country. So this we were able to obtain this data set from POEA and OA, and what it tells us is where migrants are coming from different provinces within the country, where are they going from different provinces around the country, and how much they earn, because the POEA does have to approve OFW's contracts, and so the data set actually also includes their annual earnings in whatever currency they're earning in overseas. So this data is essential for our study. We wouldn't have been able to do this study without these data, and I think it's fair to say that no prior study like this has been done, because it's very difficult to get, frankly, it's very difficult to get data on sub-regions within a country. So within the Philippines, we're looking at provinces. It's very difficult to get data at the sub-regional level within a country, detailing where migrants are going overseas, what countries they're going to, and how much they earn. So this data is actually essential for us to calculate our shift share variable that allows us to do this analysis. It also allows us to provide the first estimate of migrant income and global income in the Philippines. Basically use the earnings from these data to calculate total migrant income accruing to migrants from different provinces and to track that number over time. Okay, so let's move on. So here's the exchange rate shock that we're taking advantage of. We're showing a number of different countries here, represented by different formatted lines on this graph from 1990 to 2018. The vertical axis is Philippine pesos per unit of foreign currency. So a vertical movement is an appreciation of the overseas currency vis-a-vis the Philippine peso. And so you can see quite dramatically here, in 1997, and all of these numbers are normalized to 1 in 1996. So you can really see what happens after 1996. There's this, very, very stark positive movement, quite a big shock that happens after 97. All of these exchange rates move, almost all of these exchange rates move quite dramatically in the positive direction, appreciating against the Philippine peso. And that's generating big gains for migrant households in the Philippines who happen to have migrants in these countries overseas. This is a big positive shock to migrant income. And that exchange rate movement remains fairly stable and persistent over the following 20-year period. So this is not an exchange rate, as we all know, in the Philippines, the Philippine peso did not revert to its prior level vis-a-vis the US dollar and other currencies. These exchange rate shocks were fairly stable over time. And this is the variation in exchange rate shocks that we're exploiting in the paper. I think in the interest of time, I won't go into the details of how we construct the shift share measure, but I just want to say that this shift share measure ZO post intuitively basically is a measure of the size of the positive shock to migrant income that each province got from before to after the Asian financial crisis. I'm happy to go into this in detail if people want to in the Q&A, but let me just, in the interest of time, let me move on. Here's our regression equation. So we are regressing an outcome variable Y for province O. O stands for origin, province O in year T, on province fixed effects, year fixed effects, the shift share variable ZO post. And so our coefficient of interest is going to be beta 1 on the shift share variable, and that's going to represent the impact of a positive movement in migrant income on the outcome variable. We're also going to control for the components of the shift share variable separately, as well as a vector pre-shock province and destination characteristics interacted with post. Our data is going to be a panel of provinces observed from various periods before 1997, before the shock, and several periods after the shock, all the way up to as far as 2015 or 2018, 2 decades later. So I'm going to show you some regression coefficients documenting the estimated impacts on income and consumption. So basically, we show regression specifications without controls, with destination controls only, destination and province controls, and controls for trade and FDI in order to rule that out as a channel. And I guess the top line result is that total income per capita, there's a positive effect on total income per capita and consumption per capita in affected provinces. If we look across the full time period from 1985 to 2018. We have to look at narrower subsets of years, 1994 versus 2009, 2012, and 2015, if we want to break up global income per capita into its domestic income and migrant income per capita components, because our migrant income per capita data are limited. And we see a positive impact on global income per capita, as well as on domestic income per capita, as well as on migrant income per capita. But clearly here, the impact on domestic income per capita is about 4 times as large as the impact on migrant income per capita. And that's where my summary statement earlier comes from, that 80% of the gains in income actually show up in the form of domestic income rather than migrant income. So there's clearly improvements on both fronts, but most of the benefit is actually in the form of domestic income. Again, underlining our big picture conclusion that improvements in migrant income actually lead to development back home as well, lead to higher incomes in the domestic economy, not only in the international economy. So this is the event study diagram that I showed you before. Looking at the time here, let me just say that we also find positive impacts on education. So this is the share skilled in the general population. Skilled we define as having a college education, 14 years of education or more, and that goes up, quite visibly in the full population, as well as in the younger age groups, if you want to focus on ages 20 to 45. So clearly people are investing in education. In addition, people seem to be investing in entrepreneurship. If you look at column 4 here, entrepreneurial and rental income go up as well. We interpret that as resulting from increased investments in domestic enterprises, including property rental, which ends up being a category that we can see move explicitly. In addition, people's wage income goes up as well, and that's probably reflective of the fact that people are better educated and people are enjoying returns to education in the domestic labor market. One thing that I want to emphasize as well is that if we turn from the domestic front to thinking about the international labor market, how people are doing in the international labor market, migrants themselves are not just staying in the old types of jobs they were doing before. When a province gets a higher positive shock to migrant income, we see migrants upgrade their skill levels over time and work in higher skilled jobs, professional and production jobs. Contracts go up, but not so much service jobs, the lower skilled types of jobs. It's quite striking in the international, there's benefits, actually magnified benefits in the international labor market as well. These positive shocks to migrant income lead migrants, what we think is going on is that it's leading households to invest in education. Households then are able to send migrants away in higher skilled jobs and higher wage jobs over time. So there's actually a magnification of benefits in the international labor market as well, as families back home, as households back in the home provinces invest in education and are able to get their migrants to go away in higher skilled jobs over time. So finally, let me just say a few words about the structural model. I'm not going to be able to go into a lot of detail about the theoretical model, but basically we put together a theoretical model within which we try to make sense of the results. First of all, trying to see whether the magnitudes of the overall effects can be explained by the model. Are they at all sensible? And secondly, trying to give some sense of the mechanisms behind the overall effects. So we write down a structural model that actually draws from the trade literature. We adapt a canonical Eaton and Cordham 2002 trade model to the migration context. That's been done before by Shea et al. As well as Bryan and Morton, but we adopt it for our purposes by augmenting it in a couple of additional ways. We incorporate education and enterprise investments into the model. And this, we're imagining that migrant income helps alleviate any liquidity constraints that might be inhibiting these types of investments. The structural model, basically the one structural parameter that we estimate is theta. in these types of models, this is a wage elasticity of migration, and allows us to quantify how much migration itself goes up in response to this this shock, this improved prospects for migrant income. And it also allows us to quantify, in particular, the role of education and enterprise investments in leading to the total effects that we find. So just to, rather than showing you a bunch of equations, let me just show you a diagram that captures, the main effects, the broad, directions of effects that we flesh out in the model. So we're trying to explain the overall increase in global income, and which, of which the components are migrant income and domestic income. We're trying to link that with an initial migrant income shock that happens in 1997. So first of all, the migrant income shock leads to higher wages per migrant, and that clearly that translates into higher migrant income. Higher wages per migrant also induce more migration from provinces, which then leads to higher migration at the migrant income at the province level. The migrant income shock can also promote educational investments by removing or alleviating liquidity constraints. That educational investments themselves may lead to more migration if higher education leads to a higher ability to get overseas jobs. It can also lead to higher skilled migration, both of which will contribute further to the increase in migrant income. Educational investments will also raise domestic income because there is a return to education in the labor market. And the migrant income shock can also lead to higher domestic income also via an enterprise investment channel down over here. So the structural model allows us to estimate the share of long-run impacts that come through all of those different channels, eventually leading to higher migrant and domestic income and eventually to higher global income. So the big picture takeaway, since I think I'm just about out of time, is I'll just dial forward to the fact that about if we want to quantify the role of educational investments in leading through these different channels to higher global income, it's about 18%. So roughly, about 1/5 of the total increases in global income are due to the educational channel. And I think that's about all that I'll say about that. So let me just wrap up. So the headline result is that improvements in migrant income at the province level in the Philippines. So when provinces get exogenous increases because of exchange rate shocks in the value of their overseas migrants' earnings in Philippine pesos, that has measurable, substantial positive impacts on the domestic economy in Philippine migrants' home areas. It actually substantially raises over the following 20 years the ability to generate income in the home provinces in the form of both wage work and income from household enterprises and rental activities. So there's clear positive impacts on the domestic economy as well. So in answer to skeptics about migration, that perhaps migration doesn't actually lead to development of the home country economy, we can offer evidence to the contrary. There's actually quite substantial positive impacts, positive benefits in terms of economic development, higher income generating capacity in the home provinces when there are these improvements in migrant income in the international economy. I think the last thing I'll say is that, for thinking from an international standpoint, from the standpoint of foreign aid and development policy making, migration-related policy is actually development policy because any improvements in policies that will improve migrant income prospects, the ability to earn income in the international economy actually does have positive development benefits for home areas. So let me stop there. Thank you again for the opportunity to present this work, and I'm very happy to take questions. In fact, Gaurav and I are both very happy to answer questions. Looking forward to hearing from folks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dean. That was really a very interesting and informative presentation. I really liked what I've heard that migrants invest more in education. Anecdotal, and usually the typical results that I hear is that they invest more on real estate, which you also showed in your presentation. But it's good to hear about the investing in human capital. Okay, we actually have already a lot of questions in the chat box. Let me call first Alfredo Paloyo. Palois, you have a clarificatory question. You may unmute and show yourself.
Hi, thanks very much. Actually, Gaurav already answered that question in a DM. But in any case, I have a few others. So thanks very much, Dean, for the presentation. I like that it's kind of like triangulates with another work with Caroline and Paulo with the nurses migrating out of the
Yes.
Philippines, right?
Yeah.
So we do have now kind of like accumulating evidence over the fact that migration really does improve not just income for the migrating individual, but also for the households that the individual has left behind. But I
Yeah.
do have like one question for clarification. So when migrants leave the Philippines, usually their launching point is Manila, right? So I wonder whether there are data issues with respect to, when they fill out the form and they ask for their permanent address in the Philippines, they might just write, I come from NCR, when in fact, they come from Cebu or
Yeah.
somewhere else.
Yeah. So the data in the I think we can't rule out that that's a form of measurement error in some cases. But the important I think one thing that I didn't mention is that the address information is actually the address of the OFW's primary beneficiary for this from the standpoint of any benefits that OWA would provide. OWA provides a number of benefits and services for OFW families, but including repatriation of remains in tragic situations where OFWs pass away overseas. And so I think that the incentive there is actually to provide the correct information about the family from wherever they happen to be located. Now, with the family, so I think it's unlikely that OFWs will be giving their last temporary address if they happen to be in Manila for a short period before they departed. Every incentive is there for them to provide the correct address of their closest, most connected family, wherever they are in the Philippines.
Yeah, and then just one like super boring question.
Yeah.
And I hate to be that guy, but what do we do with like, because there are like 74 provinces in the data set. Do we worry about, because you said you clustered at the province level, should we, for statistical inference, I mean, do we consider like wild bootstraps for these types of scenarios?
Oh, I didn't. Yeah, thank you for asking this. It's okay to be that guy. Our standard errors are actually the Borosiak, Hull, and Jaravel standard errors that account for the correlation of shocks across provinces that may have similar exposure shares. So just in that the inference issue is, there is an inference issue. You're exactly right, but as Borosiak, Hull, and Jaravel show, it's not actually spatial correlation as much as the fact that different provinces that share the same types of shocks are sort of effectively reducing our sample size. So we need to cluster, it's their method allows us to do that. So it's not spatial clustering, but it's clustering across units of analysis, provinces that have similar shocks.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking. Yeah.
Okay. Palois is joining us from University of Wollongong in Australia. Thanks, Paloy, for joining us this morning.
Okay.
We have another question from Carlos Tamang. Kindly let us know your institutional affiliation. You may unmute and show yourself. Carlos Tamang?
Carlos Tapang, maybe?
Yes, Carlos
Okay.
Tamang.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. The first question is about negative effects. So like, for example, most families sort of become broken, right? If the father or the mother leaves to work outside of the country. This was not part of your study, but I'm just wondering, I hear a lot of things like, kids without the father, grow up, even though they're educated, grow up missing their father, and so you may have some psychological effects.
Yeah. No, I thank you for raising that. I mean, let me be clear. We're not attempting to capture all possible effects of international migration and migrant income. we're very much clearly saying we want to estimate the impact on income per capita in the province and consumption per capita in the province, and then sort of related outcomes like education levels and entrepreneurial income.
There are also new trends happening, right? Like the call centers, the people who work there get their income from the outside. So that's kind of FDI. Isn't that also increasing at this time?
That could be that. That I think that there's some very interesting studies to be done on BPO call centers, sort of like these international outsourcing type jobs. I think I wanted to just to finish my response, Carlos, to your first question.
Yeah, sorry.
There's no question that in some cases international migration has negative consequences. Our study doesn't speak to those psychological, psychic, social, emotional outcomes. That's absolutely right. So we're making no claims about that. So I think one needs to take our evidence about the economic side of things and weigh that against any social costs that there might be of international migration. And there's no question that international migration does come with costs. There's a reason why not everyone is a migrant or wants to be a migrant. It's difficult. You're separated from your family. People have there are psychological consequences and happiness consequences of international migration. Certainly there are economic benefits, which is what our paper is about, but there are potentially social emotional costs that our analysis doesn't take into account. So we need to weigh all of those things, but at least our aim has been to provide solid evidence on the economic side of things.
Okay.
Thank you. And I do have another question, if I could.
Can I get back to you, Carlos, so we can entertain the others?
Thank you.
Yes, let me read a question from our former dean, Dean Nandi Aldaba. Thanks for your talk, he said. What happens if the shock is negative? For example, pandemic. Do you expect completely opposite effects on household in terms of impact? Or are the effects muted since remittances remain resilient despite negative shocks?
That's a great question. Now, of course, we also know that people do get repatriated as well, for various reasons. The pandemic is one case, but when there's political unrest, civil conflict in various destinations, like in the Middle East recently, migrants do return, and that can be a negative shock to migrant income and to remittances. Our study can't shed light on that because, as I said, all of the shocks we're looking at are actually positive. And so we're just taking advantage of variation in the positiveness of the shocks across provinces to estimate our effects. If I were to speculate, it's not entirely clear that the effects would be symmetric. I'm not sure that we would necessarily see negative movements, mainly because one thing that we think is going on that I didn't have much of a chance to get into is that there's the possibility that these shocks are actually alleviating poverty traps. They're getting people out of poverty traps. So if these shocks are leading people to be able to invest their way out of poverty, by a small enterprise or by investing in education, that actually I would hope that there's a strong component of that that's not reversible. Once someone is educated, a negative shock that occurs later to migrant income or that leads some OFWs to have to return isn't going to lead that education to disappear. So once the education gets invested in, it actually persists, and actually that can be a source of resilience going forward. There's a lot more to say on that topic, but I think it's not entirely clear that if you got a negative shock that we would see symmetric movements in the other direction.
Yeah, that was I was actually interested in, because when you're invest in human capital, that may have an implication on intergenerational poverty, that decrease in the intergenerational poverty. So maybe you can also track that in, maybe not in this paper, but for future research, since you have that long data from 1980 to 2018. That would be really interesting. Yeah, Dean Nandi has is having technical issues, so he cannot show himself or ask a question. So he asked me to read it. Let me now call Jovi, the Kanay. Jovi, you may unmute and ask your question yourself. Jovi, are you there? Okay, Jovi. Oh, let me call first Alvin. Alvin. And then I'm going to call Irwin and then Teresa Toyao. Alvin, are you there? You may unmute and show yourself. Okay, let me call now Irwin, and then I'll just read their questions later. Irwin Cruz, please let us know your institutional affiliation as well when you ask your question. Irwin?
Hi, sorry, wag na lang wag na lang video.
Yes, that's fine.
Yeah, I teach part-time sa sa Ateneo. I just want to ask if the data that you also looked at included profiles of the foreign employers. I mean the actors who are the people who are employing foreign migrants, and if they have any indication of like stability of income, if they're like for example, if OFWs are employed by like a company as compared to other types of employers, like overtime.
That's actually really interesting. We haven't thought about that. The migrant contract data does have some information on the employers that we haven't really thought much about taking advantage of. So, Gaurav, maybe we should think about that. Thank you for raising that question. We haven't explored that dimension of the data at all, but I think it's a good question. Does this shock lead to changes in differential changes in income over time from different types of employers overseas? That's a question we haven't investigated. So thank you for raising that.
Okay. Just to add a comment on that, because the reason why I add that is because I read this paper. I already forgot where that particular paper, but it stuck. But back in the 1970s, this paper said that like Korean foreign workers were mostly hired overseas by Korean companies. So that somehow, even though like you mean Korean companies like being how to say contracted to do projects, overseas. So that had like so I'm not sure if I can remember right that like most of them had were employed by Korean companies, but there was in that particular study of Korean foreign workers, like in the 1970s, they had they took into account Korean companies overseas, winning projects overseas to build this and that in their data. So maybe it's so it's worth exploring because yeah,
I think that's a great idea. Thank you for raising that.
Thanks, Irwin. Let me now call Teresa Tuliao.
Yeah.
Well,
thank you very much. I'm from De La Salle University.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Yang, for that very comprehensive and insightful presentation. My question is on the exchange rate shocks. It seems that migration and to some extent remittances are influenced by a rapidly depreciating Philippine peso. But we know for a fact too that in some years the peso has been appreciating. How was that captured in your model? And the second is the transfer of some of our OFWs to their to other destinations. Okay, so they are strict in, let's say, for example, Middle East. They can transfer to Southeast Asia or Europe. Okay, thank you very much. That's all.
So those are both very very good questions. We try to keep things relatively simple in the paper. You're absolutely right that there are year-to-year fluctuations in exchange rates. In some years, the Philippine peso appreciates to some degree. The first thing I'll say is that really, if you look over that long time period between the late 80s until 2018, no exchange rate movement is as big as that exchange rate movement that happens in 97. I think we all know that if we think back in time to this entire 30-year period, that's if there was one thing you wanted to say, if you wanted to highlight in that period in terms of exchange rate movements, that is the one big movement. And then the annual movements before and after that are all relatively minor. Not that there are no changes, you're absolutely right, but the annual changes from aside from that 1997 shock are relatively minor in comparison. So to keep things simple in our analysis, we basically just compare the pre-19. You can basically think about our analysis as comparing the pre-1997 period with the post-1997 period on average, without taking into account the relatively small year-to-year changes.
Well, excuse my ignorance, Professor Yang, okay? But the initial shock in 1997 will have only an effect, well, after 2 years. So how did you account for the changes in subsequent years?
Well, the answer is we basically, I think it's what I just said. We basically compare the in all periods prior to 97 with all periods after 97 on average. So effectively, we're not exploiting year-to-year fluctuations. We're basically just saying, how does province income and consumption levels change from before 97 to after 97 in response to this, the shift share variable that we constructed to measure the size of the shocks in migrant income. I mean, that's all I can say about that. You do have a second question that I wanted to address. Your other question was, can't migrants move from places that got poor exchange rate shocks to places that got very good exchange rate shocks? And certainly they can. There's some movement, but there's actually a lot of persistence as well in where people go from different Philippine provinces. And we think that's driven by persistence in the activities of recruitment agencies. I think this is going to be a subject for another paper of ours. But one thing that's quite striking in the data is that if you look over time from the early 1990s until even very recent years, there's quite a lot of persistence in where people go overseas from different Philippine provinces. They don't, it's not the case at all that a province as a whole can easily shift their entire, portfolio of migrants to going to entirely new destinations. There's still a lot of persistence over time. We think driven by the activities of recruitment agencies that tend to specialize in certain overseas destinations. But there's a lot more to be said about that.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor Toliao. The question from Alvin is joining us on Facebook, so let me read his question. This is Alvin Ang from Department of Economics, Ateneo. Always great research from you, Dean. It would be good to find out in the future what is the impact of the free tertiary education policy and how much of education investments are shifted. Any thoughts on this, Dean?
I agree that would be a great research study to conduct. It's not, it's separate from what we're doing here.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to punt on that question. I mean, I would guess that the free tertiary education, education policy would increase educational investments, but that's not based on any research that I've done.
Yeah,
I'd
yeah.
love to hear about it if you have done research of that sort.
It's fairly recent, the pre-education program. It's fairly recent. Yeah, let me now call Jovi Dakanay. She's raising her hand. Jovi?
Yeah, thank you so much, Maha. Actually, I said in my question, I thought that perhaps my question was answered, but I will just ask nevertheless. So, Professor Dean, thank you so much. It's a novel. Your approach is very noble, and I appreciate it so much. So, my first question is, since you got data from POEA and OWA, isn't it that the data set is primarily per migrant worker? Can I assume that?
Yeah.
Yes. And however, in your analysis, you accumulated the remittances as well as income per province. No? So in effect, you put them together. No? The data set, which is basically migrant worker, was accumulated in terms of their province, no? Where they come from and where they send the remittances. Am I right?
So we take the data from POEA and OWA, which are at the individual contract level, and we aggregate it up to the province level because we know where the migrant whose contract it is came from within the Philippines.
Yes.
So yes, you're exactly right. That's what we do.
Yes, yes. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so
Yeah.
much. Now, however, I just would like to give some comments which is linked to what Professor Aldaba had mentioned, no? As regards the negative shocks. No? I'm also looking at remittances, but from a macro level. So I'm looking at it as total data, which is reported by the BSP. There have been reports and even studies from other countries expecting a downturn in remittances given the pandemic. They were actually expecting a downturn, but then no, it didn't decrease. With the pandemic, it did not decrease at all. In fact, it even increased. So, in effect, as you have mentioned, in spite of the negative shocks that the Philippines has experienced, remittances were always having a growth. So, could we intuit in some way behavior, as far as the migrant workers are concerned? Like they know that there's a negative shock in their country of origin, but they will just give whatever is needed.
So I think that's a really that's a type of observation. I completely agree. It's a surprising fact, and it's not just the Philippines where you've seen this, but in many other countries, there's been a surprising, been surprising that remittances haven't declined, and actually in some cases have gone up. And I think the certainly migrant workers themselves are suffering around the world, just like everybody is, from the pandemic-related downturns and lockdowns. But I think it's in the end, I think it's quite reasonable that remittances haven't declined, and in fact may in some places have gone up. When you think about why, when migrants are deciding how much to send home, they are certainly influenced by their own income levels. When their own income levels go down, they may send lower remittances as well. But at the same time, if their family members are suffering, if their family members are also experiencing negative shocks, then they actually have more incentive than before to send remittances. And so those two forces counteract one another. So the pandemic may by itself, because migrant incomes have gone down, cause remittances to fall, but the pandemic is also causing their family members to suffer. So remittances may rise. And in the end, it's not clear how that's going to pan out. And in a lot of cases, it actually may lead migrants to send more than they were before. Remember, migrants do have savings. Maybe we might think that migrants aren't saving as much as they should, but many migrants do have savings, and so they may be drawing down their savings in order to send more remittances, or they may be sending a higher share of their lower income in order to make up for, in order to continue to help their families at a higher level. So I think, when you take into account those two different forces, it's certainly possible, and in fact, it's happened, that remittances could actually have gone up because of the pandemic.
Yes. May I ask a third question?
Jovi, let me get back to you, okay? Because
Okay, thank you.
let me just give the one question to Carlos Tapang, who requested to ask a second question. I didn't catch your institutional affiliation, Carlos. Could you let us know as well?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I am an entrepreneur here in the U.S. and I am in fact starting a remittance business to the Philippines. And right now we are applying for a money transmitter license here in Washington State.
Oh, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, and I've been sending money to the Philippines, of course. My other question actually was asked by somebody else. It was about a negative shock, and then we're assuming that there's going to be a negative effect. But apparently, as indicated by the amount of remittances coming in during the pandemic, not necessarily so, right? A negative shock can still cannot mean a negative effect. And I think, yes, that shows the resilience of the people who work outside. My other concern is, of course, the positive effects are very good, and that's really good news. This is really good news for me, and I've been waiting for some study like this that will show that there are in fact positive effects. After all, I'm going to be in the remittance business. The other thing that came to mind is, are there other economic programs that the government can do aside from this that would improve the country's GDP? For example, changing the constitution so that we get rid of the 60-40 requirement for foreign investors to invest in the Philippines. Like if a foreign investor comes in and he sees the 60-40 and he wants to set up a factory, that's a disincentive, right? On the other hand, there are people, of course, who would offer their services. I can pretend to be the 60% owner. I'm a Filipino, but you can actually, own all of it. And there's something like that going on, of course, right? To counteract the law. And so what happens is that mostly the people who are investing in the Philippines, foreign investors, are the ones that we don't like, who are not sensitive to the laws. And the ones that we like, the ones that big companies, for example, for Intel used to be there, right? They moved out. And for those companies, we basically are at a loss. We lose in those cases. So that's the question. Is there? Of course, there must be other economic programs that the government can do aside from encouraging OFWs.
Carlos, that's a great question. I'm going to draw upon, sort of the broader development economics literature globally when answering your question. Really, it seems a little bit self-serving because I just gave this talk, but really, if you compare development, if you look at development programs and policies and anti-poverty policies that we have evidence for around the world, there is no program out there that does more to improve people's income than international migration. Moving someone from a developing country to a developed country leads their income to grow by several times. Now, it depends on what country we're talking about, what the origin country is and what the destination country is. But for the most part, there's no anti-poverty program that we know of on the planet that can lead your income to grow by 2 or 4 or 8 times. the most effective policies out there, we might consider a policy very effective, like an anti-poverty like a microfinance program or a program to help the poor build up business assets. We might be very happy if it raises their income by 10 or 20%. We consider that a successful program. But nothing does more than international migration. So I mean, I'm not saying that should be the only type of policy the governments should pursue. They should pursue many different types of policies. They should open up they should liberalize trade. They should liberalize capital flows within reason. With prudential measures in place, of course, to avoid temporary dislocation. But I think that the big unexploited type of policy for development on the planet today, I think it is about international labor migration. So as I mentioned earlier, 94% of countries developing countries are thinking about international labor migration in some way in their development policy making. And I hope that our results will help convince more governments to scale up those efforts and think about that more seriously.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. Dean, I don't know the time with you, but I still have 3 questions. Can you still accommodate them?
Yes. Sure.
Okay. These are 2 questions from Facebook, from Jason Pagaduan, I think from ADB. For the first question, in aggregating the migrant income to the province level, is it normalized by the population share of the municipality where the migrant is located? So that's the first question. The second question is, how sensitive are the causal effects to stricter fixed effects structures, e.g. controlling region-specific year trend?
Thank you for asking. Do you mind repeating who that question, who that came from again?
From Jason Pagaduan, researcher from ADB.
Okay, great. Thank you. So the first, in answer to the first question about how we scale up the migrant data to the province level, we calculate what we do in practice is we calculate for every destination, or actually in aggregate, we calculate the average migrant income among migrants originating from a particular province. And then we scale up the income based on the number of migrants in the province based on census data. So we basically use what we officially do is we use the POEA and OA data to calculate an average wage per migrant for migrants from the province. And then we apply that wage to every person that we know from the census is an OFW. And that's how we scale it up to the province level. We do a number of, and then when it comes to the identification, we do a number of things in the paper. I didn't get to go through it in a lot of detail in the presentation, but please see the paper for details. Happy to share it with you, and we'll share it with the organizers so they can arrange for that to be available. We include a variety of different controls in the regression to test robustness of our conclusions. And the coefficient estimates are always very stable to a variety of different controls. We follow Borosiak et al., Borosiak and Jaravel by, in particular, including destination level controls, which is something that's not typically done in these types of shift share analyses, but should be, as Borosiak and Jaravel point out. So we follow all of their sort of state-of-the-art recommendations for how to confirm exogeneity and the causal interpretation of results, and I think you'll find that overall, we think it's a very plausible case to be made that these are causal results.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jason, for joining us on Facebook. One last question. Okay, Jovi, coming from Jovi is a faculty at the University of Asia and the Pacific.
Yes, thank you so much, Maha. So Professor Young, I just would like to know, I'm interested to know, has the demographics changed across the data series, from 1985 up to the present? Or have they been stable?
Now, when you say demographics, yeah, I see your question in the chat. You're referring to the demographics of the migrant workers or of the population at home?
Yes, right. Migrant workers, yes.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the exciting results that unfortunately didn't have as much chance to emphasize in the presentation, but it's in the paper. The characteristics of the migrants are actually changing over time. So when a province gets a more positive shock to migrant income because of the Asian financial crisis, it seems that households are investing in education, and therefore more households are migrating, and those more households are sending out migrants. So there's more migrants going out, and those migrants that do leave have higher education levels. They're more likely to have college degrees in particular. That means they're also going overseas in higher skilled jobs and higher wage jobs. So I think that's one of the really important secondary results of the paper. I think, if those were, frankly, I would hope that if that was the only result in the paper, that would also be incredibly interesting. We do find that to be incredibly interesting. We view that, but it's in the set of the other results, we view that as one of the secondary results of the paper, because there are other results that we think are more interesting. But I think, if just the fact that the migrant skill levels are going up and migrants are going away in higher skilled jobs over time, that's a very nice positive development as well that's arising from these initial migrant income shocks.
Yes, thank you so much. Very interesting result. Thank you.
Yeah. A lot of promising research coming out of this discussion, Dean, and also Garav and the rest of your team. So we hope to hear more from you. At this point, I'd like to invite everyone to turn on their camera so we can have a photo opportunity with our speakers. And before you do that, let me also invite you to visit our website where you can find the materials from the previous seminar. It turns out that this is already our last seminar for this semester, because our supposed to be seminar for December will be postponed to next semester.